Well, howdy again, folks. Welcome to the Boondocking Bears. We're going to do another video today, and believe it or not, this is our 99th episode. And you know, it was supposed to be about full-time RVing, and that's certainly where it's going to go. We've been delayed a year by circumstances totally beyond our control, but it's coming. In the meantime, I've been making other videos that you've seen. Today I'm going to do a little different one, though, for our 99th video, and it's going to be on a topic that I'm really passionate about. It's the American Civil War, and in particular the cause of it. Now it's a topic that creates a lot of debate. There's a lot of difference of opinion. Some people get very passionate about it. That's not my goal today. I'm not in an argumentative mood. I just want to present an empirical look at the war record and see where it leads us. Try and apply or take away the conjecture and opinion, particularly put forth by the modern historians in their accepted narrative of what happened in the war. And some of the conclusions that they come to, I really have to question. And that's what I'm going to do with this video. Now, I have no dog in the fight. I'm not a northern supporter or a southern supporter. I just want to look at the war record, add the facts, the empirical information, and see where it takes us. I said to Krista when we were planning this video that this is going to be a little different. It's going to be a lot longer than normal, and it's going to be a fairly serious topic done in a fun way, but a relatively serious topic, and I'm not sure it's appropriate for our channel. And she said, hey, you know, if you're passionate about it, do it, and show them that you got more than just a pretty face. So I want to say right up front that as a good Civil War general, you've got to have a fallback position, and you're looking at my pretty face. Anyway, let's have some fun. The topic is the cause of the Civil War, and let's get to it. Now, there's a big old elephant in the room when it comes to discussing the cause of the American Civil War. Discussing that elephant, even for contemporary historians, is difficult, and they often skirt around it. And if they acknowledge it at all, attribute little significance to it as a root cause of the war, because doing so brings to light some uncomfortable truths about America of that time that many prefer not to acknowledge. So this video is going to address that big old elephant. Now, as many viewers know, the generally accepted cause of the Civil War, as put forth by most contemporary historians, runs along two paths. The first is that the war resulted from an ongoing commercial dispute over 40-plus years, manifesting itself in the form of perceived punitive tariffs imposed on the South by a Congress increasingly dominated and controlled by the Northern majority. Tied to that issue of growing Northern political influence was a question of great concern to the South, that being the role Northern congressional power might have on Western expansion across the continent in coming years, a policy the South saw as important, both as a means of effectuating a congressional balance and promulgate their Southern way of life. So from that perspective, political influence and power is often touted as a contributing factor leading to the war. Then also the question of state rights enters the mix as championed by some historians, and in particular the issue of the legal validity of Southern states seceding from the Union. In a nutshell, those are commonly accepted reasons that led America to civil war. So let's get into it. Now, let's have some fun and see if we can make sense of this in a way that eliminates conjecture and opinion and assesses the cause based on empirical evidence, the war record, if you will. So what caused this American Civil War? Now, to address this meaningfully, there are three inextricably entwined questions need asking, to which the answers provide our answer to the topic. And they are: 1. Did Abraham Lincoln instigate the Civil War? 2. Did any of Lincoln's arguments that secession was illegal stand up? And 3. What in fact was at the bottom of the Civil War, if not slavery? So let's deal with the first. Did Lincoln instigate the war? Well, yes, he did. Disregarding the historian's narrative, based on the collective record of all the participants, yes, Lincoln instigated the war based on the empirical evidence of the day. The question is, how did he do it? And why? Now, between April 1st and April 6th, 1861, Lincoln conspired with Secretary of War William Seward to induce the Confederate government to believe that he was sending a fleet of warships with troops on board to force an entrance into Charleston Harbor for the purposes of reinforcing the garrison at Fort Sumter, when in fact he was not. The evidence of this is plain and undisputed. It's buried and largely ignored by the historians, but it's there. So the evidence you can find is in Lincoln's collective works and in the official record of the rebellion. There are a series of messages Lincoln caused to be sent to the commandant of the Brooklyn Naval Yard and to Captain Mercer, who was in command of the warship Powhatan. The first message was, quote, dated Washington, April 1st, 1861, to Brooklyn Navy Yard Commander. Fit the Powhatan without delay. Lieutenant David Porter will relieve Captain Mercer in command of her. She's bound on secret service, and you will not inform the Navy Department that she's fitting out. Signed, Abraham Lincoln. Then a second message was sent, also from Washington, dated April 1st, 1861. Quote, to Captain Mercer of the Powhatan. Lieutenant D.D. Porter will take command of the Powhatan for a special purpose, and you therefore consider yourself detached. Signed, Abraham Lincoln. Now, these orders specified that Captain Mercer was to be relieved of command of the Powhatan, that Lieutenant Porter was to take his place, and that Porter, in command of the ship, was to take it to Pensacola, Florida. And that's shown in another message dated April 1st from Washington. And it reads, quote, to Lieutenant David D. Porter, and then in brackets, to be opened at sea, unbrackets. Proceed to Pensacola, Florida. Signed, Abraham Lincoln, unquote. Now, at the same time that Lincoln caused these messages to be sent to the Brooklyn Naval Yard and to Mercer by Porter, Lincoln and Seward manipulated Gideon Welles, the Secretary of the Navy, to send the Commandant of the Yard and Captain Mercer different orders. Captain Mercer received an order from Welles telling him to prepare the Powhatan for sea for the purposes of taking it to Charleston. That's quite a bit different. Now, at the same time, manipulated by Lincoln and Seward again, Welles sent similar orders to the commanders of three other naval vessels, the Pocahontas, the Pawnee, and the Harriet Lane. These were ships that were based at the Washington Naval Yard and the Norfolk Naval Yard, telling these captains to take their ships to sea and rendezvous 10 miles off Charleston Harbor, due east of the lighthouse, and wait at that station for the appearance of the Powhatan. Captain Mercer was to be the commander of this flotilla. On board the ships were troops, supplies, and ammunition. Here's the message. Quote, from Washington, April 5th, 1861, to Captain Mercer. The United States steamers Powhatan, Pocahontas, Pawnee, and Harriet Lane will compose a naval force under your command to be sent to Charleston. The object is to provision Sumter. Should the Confederates attempt to prevent resupply, you will open the way. Period. Leaving New York in time to off Charleston, 10 miles distance from the lighthouse, the morning of the 11th, there to await the arrival of the other ships. and it's signed Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles, unquote. Now, of course, we know that Lieutenant Porter was actually secretly in command of the Powhatan, and overall command of the flotilla was his, unknown to Secretary Welles. Now, a third strand of communication strings between Lincoln and Governor Francis Pickens of South Carolina, transmitted by a messenger named Robert Chew, telling Pickens that an expedition was on its way to deliver supplies to the garrison at Fort Sumter, and if the governor allowed these supplies to be transferred to the garrison, there would be no effort to force their way into the harbor. The actual message reads, quote, Washington, April 6, 1861, to Robert Chew. Proceed to Charleston, and, if on arrival the flag is still flying, obviously over Fort Sumter, procure an interview with Governor Pickens and read him this, quote, I am directed by the President to say an attempt will be made to supply Sumter with supplies only. But if such attempt is resisted, men in arms will be thrown in. Signed Abraham Lincoln, unquote. So now let's pause for a second. Now, isn't that exactly what is written in the history books? That Lincoln was just trying to supply those poor starving boys inside Fort Sumter and sanctioned a humanitarian mission, with the implication being that if you let us do this, we can continue talking about the differences between us and resolve our problems. Isn't that what is written? Isn't that what is taught in the history books? But that's not what the record shows, and I'm not condemning Mr. Lincoln, just trying to present the facts about what really happened. So let's carry on. Now, the communication between Gideon Welles and the Brooklyn Naval Yard was sent in a way to ensure it was deliberately leaked to Southern spies. So the Confederate government in Montgomery, Alabama, was aware the fleet was comprised of heavily armed warships, not just supply steamers, and would force their way into the harbor to reinforce the garrison. The Confederate government now faced its first military dilemma. Could they allow a foreign garrison about to be reinforced block entrance and commercial trade to their sovereign harbor? So from Montgomery, they issued a directive to Pierre G.T. Beauregard, in command of the Charleston forces, that if the fleet appeared, he had authority to bombard Fort Sumter, reduce it, and force its surrender before the Northern fleet could reinforce it. Effectively, Lincoln had tricked the Confederate government. He had no intention of forcing his way into Charleston Harbor, and the proof of this is evidenced by the messages between Lincoln and Porter, and that Porter, in fact, sailed right past Charleston to Pensacola, while the remainder of the flotilla stood off Charleston, awaiting his and the Powhatan's appearance. The flotilla was under orders to hold their position and not proceed without Porter's direct command, which by Lincoln's design was never going to happen. So it is uncontested that the South was the first to open fire of the war, or the rebellion if you prefer, and that was critical to Lincoln's plans. Lincoln needed that. Lincoln used this device to inflame the passions of the Northern public in a way they had not been, that allowed him to manipulate Congress and ultimately exercise war powers. It was that simple. Until then, the people of the North were in no mood to engage in war with the South. Until then, the press, the politicians for the most part, the influential leaders, and generally speaking, the people in the towns were willing to let the South go, because generally most people in America at the time thought secession was perfectly legal. So that's the gist of it. Lincoln manipulated events to inflame the passions of the North in a situation that was perfectly legitimate for the sovereign state of South Carolina, having seceded from the Union, to not want its harbor to be essentially closed to commercial traffic by the presence of a reinforced garrison at Fort Sumter, capable of preventing ships from moving in and out of the harbor. That is just an impossible situation for the state of South Carolina to allow to continue. So in that context, it was perfectly legitimate for the state to exercise its war power, to expel a foreign force from control of its harbor. Lincoln, for his part, was able to coalesce public opinion behind him in a way that had prevented him from rapidly getting an army into the field for the invasion of Virginia. So of the three factors that caused the Civil War, indeed, Lincoln surreptitiously caused the first shots to be fired, instigating the war. The cables and records are absolutely clear on this. Is it a cause of the war? Well, insofar as it began the war, it was part of the cause. So of the three questions I posed at the beginning of this video, let's deal now with question 2. I said that there are three intractably entwined causes of the Civil War. Did any of Lincoln's arguments that secession was illegal stand up? Do any of Lincoln's arguments, obviously the predicate upon which the actions of South Carolina and Lincoln depend, is the answer to Lincoln's argument that secession was illegal? Do these arguments stand up? Now, I'll present this as smoothly and as quickly as the volume of the information permits. So let's distill his arguments as he expressed them in his first inaugural address to Congress in 1861. So the first argument he presents in that inaugural address is, quote, "I hold that in contemplation of universal law and of the Constitution, the Union is perpetual. Perpetuity is implied. It is safe to say that no government ever had a provision in its own organic law, in other words, its own Constitution, for its own termination," unquote. So does this argument stand up? Lincoln has three things going on here. First off, he says, in contemplation of universal law. Well, what does that mean? What is universal law? We have to think about that as we go along. Then in the second prong, he goes on to say that somehow in the Constitution, it is implied, if not expressed, that the government formed by the Constitution is perpetual. Then he supports this idea, not by actual language in the Constitution or by reference to the actions of the parties that framed it and ratified it, but he goes off into the abstract with a statement that no government ever had a provision in its Constitution for its own termination. Now, I think I can show you from the record that this statement of Lincoln's is simply dead wrong. But first, let's go to argument number 2, which is the weaker argument. Again, from his first inaugural address, quote, "History confirms that the Union is perpetual. It is matured by the Articles of Confederation in 1778, in which all 13 states expressly promised that it should be perpetual. And finally, in 1787, one of the objects of establishing the Constitution was to, quote, form a more perfect union," unquote. So he says that, quote, history confirms that the Union is perpetual, unquote. Now he has moved away from this idea of linking the idea of perpetuity to the terms of the Constitution itself, and is now invoking in history as confirming that the Union is perpetual. And here is his authority in history, quote, "It was matured by the Articles of Confederation in 1778, in which all 13 states expressly promised that it should be perpetual," unquote. Well, that is a true statement of fact, no question about it. But so what? What does it mean in the final analysis when the true historical record is reviewed? And he goes on, quote, "And finally in 1787, one of the objects of establishing the Constitution was to form a more perfect union," unquote. So now he's linking prior history with some words in the Constitution, that being form a more perfect union. And then also from the inaugural is argument 3, and it says, quote, "If the United States be but an association of states in the nature of the contract merely, can it, as a contract be peaceably unmade by less than all the parties who made it. One party to a contract may violate it, break it, but does it not require all to lawfully rescind it?" Unquote. This is a hypothetical he's asking, invoking the common law rules of interpreting contracts. Now, from these arguments, Lincoln offers you the conclusion, quote, "that it therefore follows that no state, upon its own mere motion, can lawfully get out of the Union, that ordinances to that fact are legally void," unquote. Now, on the basis of these arguments, he announces to the world that the Union is unbroken. Then in his message to Congress on July 4th, he adds a little bit of editorial comment to these arguments by saying, for example, quote, "Secession. They invented an ingenious sophism that any state in the Union may consistently with the Constitution withdraw from the Union without consent of the government or of any other state, the supposed right to be exercised only for just cause, themselves to be the sole judges of this justice. This sophism derives much of its currency from the assumption that there is some sacred supremacy pertaining to each state of our Union, the expressed promise of each of them in the Articles of Confederation, that the Union shall be perpetual, is most conclusive," unquote. So he's gone back to that idea. Now, here Lincoln bluntly states the true basis for his assertion that secession is void and that the Union remains unbroken. He says, quote, "The states, if they ever had it, gave it up to one entering into the Union by which they acknowledged the Constitution as the supreme law of the land," unquote. So let's go to that second issue. Do these arguments that secession was illegal stand up? And let's start with a statement from Chief Justice Salmon Chase, who during the Civil War was Lincoln's Treasury Secretary and soon after became the 6th Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. In 1869, in a famous case the historians love to quote in Texas versus White, he repeats Lincoln's arguments against secession by saying this, quote, "The Union began among the colonies and was confirmed by the necessities of war and received definite form from the Articles of Confederation. And when the Articles were found to be inadequate, the Constitution was ordained to form a more perfect Union." Now, isn't that interesting? Here's his conclusion and his support for Lincoln's view. Quote, "It is difficult to convey the idea indissoluble unity more clearly than by these words. What can be indissoluble if a perpetual union made more perfect is not?" Unquote. Does that make sense? Well, it seems to, doesn't it? Then he goes on, quote, "When therefore a state may become one of the United States, she entered into an indissoluble relation. All the obligations of perpetual union attached to it wants to the state. The act of admission incorporated her into the union, and it was final. The union between Texas and the other states was as complete, as perpetual, and as indissoluble as the union between the original states. There was no place for reconsideration, if or revocation, except through revolution or the consent of the states," unquote. Now, he threw into the end the business about revolution, as if there's some distinction in law between a right of revolution, whatever that means, and a right to secede. It's as if they are different animals, different abstractions, and that's the trick. You'll see as we carry on how that distinction evaporates when you consider the reality of the historical record. Chase's logic hangs on the idea the concept of perpetuity was transferred from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution. That is a fundamental predicate that Lincoln's argument, restated by Chase, depends upon.
But on the objective record, it's plain that this is not so. On the contrary, though the word perpetual appears 5 times in the Articles of Confederation, it does not appear once in the Constitution. In the transition between the government formed by the Articles of Confederation and the government formed by the Constitution, the framers and those that ratified the Constitution dropped the term completely. Why is that? Why was the term dropped despite Lincoln's wish to rematerialize it out of old cloth? Why is that? Because the framers of the Constitution, doing their work in Philadelphia at the same time that Congress and the Articles of Confederation was at work in New York, knew the only political way open to them logically to abandon the Articles as the framing device for the general government and replace it with the Constitution was to invoke the fundamental principle of American political science that sovereignty, supreme, independent political authority belongs to the people, not to government. This principle was first articulated by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. Article 13 of the Articles of Confederation reads, quote, "The Union shall be perpetual, nor shall any alteration be made in these articles unless such alterations be agreed to in a Congress of the United States and afterwards be confirmed by the legislatures of each state." Unquote. Now that is exactly what Lincoln wants to read into the Constitution. That language is not in the Constitution. By his arguments, he is trying to read it into the Constitution. The framers in Philadelphia knew that they did not have the certain votes of the legislatures of each state, so that the government framed by the Articles, which by its express and redundant terms was supposed to be perpetual, could not be directly changed into a government framed by the Constitution by obtaining the consent of the states as political entities. The change had to happen indirectly. And this is the key that unlocks the puzzle. The change had to occur by obtaining the consent of the people of the states. As Chief Justice Chase said in Texas versus White, quote, "A state, in the ordinary sense of the word as used in the Constitution, is a political community of free citizens occupying a territory of defined boundaries and organized under government established by the consent of the governed." Unquote. Now, according to Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, governments derive their power from the consent of the people, and whenever any form of government becomes destructive of the unalienable rights of the people to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and institute a new government, organizing its power in such a form as to them, the people, shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Seizing then on the principle Thomas Jefferson had declared in 1776, justifying the colony's independence from Britain as the key to transforming the general government from one framed by the perpetual Articles to one framed by the Constitution, the framers caused the proposed Constitution to be submitted not to the legislatures of the several states, but to conventions of the people assembled in their respective states. In other words, the framers had the people of the several states correctly consent to a change in the sovereign status of their states on the predicate of the political principle Thomas Jefferson had declared in 1776. A political consequence of this, which most historians ignore, is that the adoption of the Constitution directly depended upon the people's exercise of their sovereign right to change allegiance to a government claiming power over them whenever a convention assembled. They decide that the government was acting in a manner destructive of their lives and their liberty and their happiness.
So as we move on now to consider Lincoln's arguments For this abstract proposition that a state cannot legally secede from the Union, we must keep in mind the uniquely American political theory that inherent in the Constitution is this principle of Jefferson, that the frame of government that it defines can be thrown off by the people of the state whenever a convention assembled, they decide the government is being used in a manner destructive of their lives, their liberties, and their happiness. Now, of course, this is all expressed in terms of the abstract, in terms of theory. In the real world comes the action of men driven by emotions and passion and self-interest. Now, this view of things I've expressed is not original with me. Daniel Webster, the foremost Northern senator in the decades before the war, expressed that better than I ever can. Speaking on the Senate floor in 1830, referred to what is known as the Virginia Resolution of 1798. Webster said this, quote, "The Assembly of Virginia declares that it views the powers of the federal government as resulting from the compact to which the states are parties as limited by the plain sense and intention of the instrument constituting that compact, and in this case of a deliberate exercise of powers not granted by the said compact, the states who are party thereto have the right and are duty bound to interpose with arresting the progress of this evil," unquote. Now, Webster believes that this language that is expressed in the Virginia Resolution came from James Madison, and Webster went on to say in 1830, quote, "I know the source from which the resolution proceeded. I have much respect for the constitutional opinions of Mr. Madison. But does the resolution mean no more than that there may be extreme cases in which the people, in any mode of assembly, may resist usurpation and relieve themselves from a tyrannical government? No one will deny this," unquote. Then he goes on to say further, quote, "Such resistance is not only acknowledged in America, but in England also. Blackstone admits so much. We, sir, who oppose the doctrine, do not deny that the people may, if they choose, throw off any government when it becomes oppressive and intolerable, and erect a better in its stead," unquote. So the question of meaning now shifts in shade to the issue of who exactly was it that constituted the parties to the Constitution. Is it the states as political entities, or the people of the states who hold the status of parties to the Constitution? The difference that this distinction makes is that if the states are parties, as Virginia Resolution asserts, that the state government, its legislature, can override or ignore any law passed by Congress which it considers to be the exercise of power not granted by the Constitution. But if the states are not parties, if it's the people of the states who are parties to the Constitution, then it is they, not the states, who possess the power to resist that Congress's usurpation. Now, the framers seem to have intentionally left the Constitution ambiguous about which it is, states or people of the states, who are parties. You can understand this by comparing the language of the preamble, which on one side of the argument, Lincoln, seizes on, and Article 7, the concluding ratification section of the Constitution, which the secessionist side of the argument depend on. On the one hand, we have, quote, "We the people of the United States do hereby proclaim and ordain," unquote. And on the other, we have the ratification of conventions of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution between the states ratifying the same. Now, it's a distinction without a difference. It's just the old reality of the English language providing shades of meaning for the same word, in this case, state. Here's what James Madison in 1798, as head of the committee in the Virginia legislature who vetted the language of the Virginia Resolution, had to say about the Constitution's use of the word state. Quote, "The term states
in the Constitution is sometimes used as a vague sense. Sometimes it means the separate sections of territory occupied by political societies within each, unquote. Well, that tracks with Chief Justice Chase, his definition of state. And Madison goes on, quote, other times it means that people composing these political societies in their highest sovereign capacity. Whatever different construction of the term states may be entertained, all will at least concur in the last mention because, in that sense, states ratified the Constitution, unquote. So in that sense of the term states, they are consequently parties to the compact from which the power of the federal government results. You see this in a compact in the true Lockean idea of government between the people and the government, not between the states in which these people reside in the government. And what's most important, key to the whole ongoing struggle between Lincoln's case and those on the other, is this statement, what this really means. It means that the people of the several states are in fact parties to the compact from which the powers of the federal government result, just as Madison states. And as parties, they have plainly, contrary to Lincoln's assertion, they have plainly not given up irrevocable sovereign right to throw off the government whenever, in their view, it becomes destructive of their life, liberty, and happiness. This is the fundamental response to Lincoln's sophist arguments. He would have us believe that the people of the several states, in giving their consent to this Constitution, which threw off the old government of the Articles of Confederation, that was supposed to be perpetual, gave up their most precious sovereign right, a right that they possessed by virtue of universal law. Well, what is this universal law Lincoln refers to anyway? It's not English common law. It's not the law of nations. What is it? It's the law of nature. It's that business about all men being created equal, the natural right of man, their sovereign right. Same thing. Now, regarding Lincoln's third argument, Lincoln's a lawyer. He knows full well in the setting of contract law, one side isn't going to be able to claim the other side gave up such a right unless their getting out of that right is expressly stated in the agreement. It's not to be implied. It's ridiculous to suggest it could be implied. Now, you might say the people gave up part of their sovereignty, for example, their right to make war, to a government that overarched their own. They consented to diminishing their sovereign powers they had delegated to their state governments by transferring to that extent the power to this overreaching federal government. And they did it. There is no question about it as citizens of separate states. Now, historians will give you the argument that, oh no, it was the whole people, it says the people of the United States. No, it doesn't actually say that, because if that's what it meant, then a majority of the people of the United States, which in 1789 would have been the people of New York, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. Those people alone would have caused the Constitution to become operative and the old government thrown off. But that was not the reality, proof being the ratification clause. It specifies the Constitution does not become operative until 9 states, the people of 9 states, endorse it. Remember Madison's explanation of the meaning of the word states in its most essential form inside the Constitution. It's the people of 9 states that had to consent to the Constitution before the new Union was formed. That's a revolution. Peaceable. But then there's nothing in the language of history that tells us that revolutions have to always be violent. So contrary to Mr. Lincoln's appeal, the people retained the right to throw off an oppressive government and walk away from the government they had accepted as mutually representing them. Is it not obvious now? The sovereign right to throw off an oppressive government was a right they retained. Now, that this proposition is true is recognized by the radical Republicans themselves. It's plain from the record of the United States Senate. For example, let's refer to the leading radical of them all, Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumter, speaking about the repeal of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1854. Quote, "I have not hesitated to condemn it. I am pronounced it is a violation of the Constitution. In violation of the Constitution, it commits the great question of human freedom to summary proceedings, to the judgment of a single petty magistrate. I oppose this act as unconstitutional, as it is an assumption of powers by Congress not delegated by the Constitution, and in derogation of the rights of the state, and it takes away the essential birthright of the citizen, trial by jury in a question of personal liberty. Thus obnoxious, I have regarded it as an enactment totally devoid of our constitutional obligation. I swore to support the Constitution as I understand it, not as you understand it. I am bound by that oath to oppose all enactments by Congress on the subject of fugitive slaves as a flagrant violation of the Constitution. Specially must I oppose it as a tyrannical usurpation kindred to the Stamp Act, which our fathers refused to obey." See, we're linking ourselves back to the Declaration of Independence now. But carrying on. "Here my duty under the oath I have taken as senator ends. There is nothing beyond. They are all absorbed in the constant and flexible righteous obligation to oppose every exercise by Congress of any power over this subject. I say Massachusetts at all times has been ready to do her duty under the Constitution as she understands it. We'll owe an obligation to the laws, but a higher law, to the communities in which we live, and if the former be perverted to destroy the latter, it is patriotism to disregard them." Unquote. Now, what is that language if not the same language as the Virginia Resolution and that Jefferson expressed and Madison expressed? Quote, "We owe an obligation to the laws, but a higher one, the communities in which we live," unquote. In other words, the political societies of our states. Quote, "And is the former be perverted to destroy the latter, it is patriotism to disregard them," unquote. Now, whatever emphasis the historians wish to give the constitutional phrase supreme law of the land, the phrase Lincoln invokes to bolster his abstractions and sophistries, quote, "the higher law," Sumner invokes as nothing more or less than the bedrock political principle upon which the legitimacy of the Constitution stands. The right of the people of the several states to change their allegiance to government. That is a principle. Who can argue? That is enshrined in the Constitution by virtue of the actions that gave it birth. The means and methods by which the framers chose to give birth. It's the framers that invoked the principle to give birth to the Constitution in place of the Articles of Confederation. And but for the exercise, there could have been no Constitution in the abstract, in the theory of political science, given the barrier that Lincoln wants to raise with the use of the word perpetual, linking it to more perfect union. Now, in the ratifying actions, both Virginia and New York make clear that by consenting to the government of the Constitution, the people of their states expressly retained their natural right to throw the government off if they decided it was acting oppressively. Here's what the Virginia delegates had to say in consenting on behalf of the people to the Constitution. Quote, "We, the delegates of the people of Virginia, do in the name of the people declare that the powers granted under the Constitution be derived from the people of the United States may be resumed by them whensoever the same shall be perverted to their injury or oppression, and every power not granted thereby remains with them and at their will. On this basis, we, the said delegates on behalf of the people, do assent to and ratify the Constitution," unquote. Now let's look at the delegates of New York. Quote, "We, the delegates of the people of the state of New York, in this convention assembled declare that all power is originally vested in the people, unquote. This is the organic law Lincoln is hiding from. Quote, all power is originally invested in the people, and that government is instituted by them for their common interest and happiness, that the powers of government delegated may be reassumed by the people whenever it shall be necessary to their happiness, and the powers not delegated are retained by the people, including the right of the people to keep and bear arms, that a well-regulated militia is the natural and safe defense of a free state, unquote. Now, did Lincoln, as President of the United States, have the constitutional power to wage war against the seceded states? Well, absolutely he did. But did he have the power on the basis of the arguments he manufactured in his first inaugural address and in his message to Congress in July of 1861? No, he did not, because by then the slave states were lawfully out of the Union by virtue of the exercise of their inherent natural sovereign right to change their allegiance to governments whenever it suits them. They are now out of the Union.
The Union is unbroken. The government isn't destroyed. It continues as an entity that holds sway over lesser territory. But being out of the Union as a matter of intelligent political theory, they are a foreign power now. The Confederate States of America is a foreign power. Now it's competing with the United States of America for exploitation of the North American continent. Now, there's going to be the issue of division of territories of the United States west of the Mississippi River. There's going to be the issue of navigation and the right of travel. And all these issues are going to create a tremendous friction between the people of the several states, so that it seems reasonably clear that resolution of these issues by force of arms is going to be the inevitable consequence of the new existence of the Confederate States of America. As such, in the course of international relationships, the President of the United States, as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, with the authority of Congress, can wage war, and that is definitely what President Lincoln did, what he intended to do, and manipulated events to allow himself to do, and history should recognize the reality. It's something about guilt, political guilt, that is being perpetuated by the historians of our day. They all seem married to the idea of protecting Lincoln's generation from the reality that it is the northern people who indeed acted aggressively, warlike toward the southern people who wanted nothing but to leave peacefully. Now, was that a naive political idea on the part of the southern people? Well, of course it was, given the nature of human beings. But we must call a thing what it is and stop pretending that it is something else. And if we do that, we have to get to this third issue about what was really at the bottom of the cause of the American Civil War. Now, as the war went on, slavery, as the northern historians in their majority want to tell us it was, places the onus for the war on the South. It shifts the burden of the war, the cause of the war, the responsibility for the war onto the Southern people. It exonerates the Northern people. This is a Korsman historical narrative and reality. This is the mindset that history is obscuring here. Well, let's call a thing what it is. So let's look at this final issue. What, in fact, was at the bottom of the cause of the Civil War, if not slavery? Now, I put forward to you that the bottom, the underpinning cause of the Civil War was racism. Plain and simple, white racism. It was a racism that had no borderline, equally invasive, infecting the minds of the white men north of the Mason-Dixon line as well as white men south of the Mason-Dixon line. It was a universal racism among white men in America. That's a bold statement. So, to support that statement, I will quote three great senators who spoke on the Senate floor. The first is Henry Clay, renowned as possibly the greatest senator of all time, speaking on the Senate floor on February 7th, 1839. At a time the Senate was being inundated with petitions from abolition groups to somehow use the words and phrases in the Constitution as an excuse to abolish slavery. The second senator is Daniel Webster, speaking on March 7, 1850, followed 5 days later by William Seward, senator from New York, at the time the leading Republican of this new nascent party fielding its first presidential candidate in 1856. So let's start with Henry Clay and see if we can find in his words a grasp of this core infection that constitutes the real objective human cause of the American Civil War. Quote, "The point of attack the abolitionists are making is the institution of domestic slavery as it exists in those states. It is to liberate 3 million slaves held in bondage within them. Let's look at the insurmountable obstacles. The first obstacle is an absolute want of all power on the part of the general government to effect that purpose. The Constitution creates a limited government, leaving the residual mass of political power in the possession of the several states. The Constitution could never have been formed upon the principle of investing the general government with the power to abolish slavery at its pleasure. It never could be continued a single day if the exercise of such power be assumed or usurped. The slavery is our affair, not theirs. Why not leave it to us as the common constitution of our country has left it? The second obstacle arrives from the fact of the presence of 3 million slaves. They are there, part and parcel of our population. The slaves are here and must remain in some condition. What is to be done with them? In the slave states, the alternative is that the white must govern the black, or the black govern the white. In several of the states, blacks outnumber the whites. Abolition would immediately be followed by a war of extermination. This is our true ground to defense for the continued existence of slavery in our country," unquote. That was Henry Clay on the floor of the Senate. A war of extermination between the white population and the black population for control of government. But Clay goes on, quote, "The third obstacle is to be found in the immense amount of capital which is invested in the slave property. The average value of a slave now has $500. The total value then is 1,200 millions. It is proposed by these abolitionists by a single fiat of legislation to annihilate this immense amount of property, to annihilate it without indemnity and without compensation to the owners. Does any reasonable person believe it possible to effect such an object without convulsion, a revolution, and of bloodshed?" Unquote. Now folks, even in our time, putting ourselves in the shoes of these people as they lived in 1839, these three obstacles we can see are real and substantial. But why are they real? And why are they substantial? That's an incredibly important question. Why can't they be accommodated, extinguished, pacified? What is preventing that from happening? Well, Henry Clay goes on, quote, "This is not all. The abolitionists oppose all separation of the races. They would keep the two races pent up together within the same limits, perpetuating their animosities and constantly endangering the peace of the community. They proclaim that color is nothing, that the organic," there's that word again, "and characteristic differences between the two races ought to be discarded, in that we ought to take the blacks into our bosom on the same footing of equal social condition. Such would be an unnatural amalgamation. Who is to begin it? Is it their purpose to not only create a competition?" Now, this is the core. Think about it. "Competition between black labor and white labor?
Do they intend to contaminate the laboring classes at the North by a revolving admixture of the black element? Unquote. Now, think about these men in terms of the leadership. They are a handful of men, but they are leaders. They are all Republicans now. Some used to be Democrats, some used to be Whigs. This is the Thaddeus Stevens, the Charles Sumners, and the John Bingham of Ohio types. Now think about all that. At this time and in the coming decades, millions of Irish people, as destitute as any African slave, are emigrating from the oppression of Ireland under the British rule and ending up in Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and Missouri. Germans are fleeing religious persecution at the same time in the millions and coming up the Mississippi River into that exact same area. Millions and millions of white immigrants. Now, do these people, mostly laborers, want to be in competition with free black men? Can we not understand the black man is going to undercut the wages of the white man? That sounds terribly racist today, but it was the reality in the streets of the pre-war North. This is how people thought then. Quote, abolition will unite one side against the other. Union on one side will beget union on the other, and that consolidation will be attended with all the violent prejudices and bitter passions and implacable animosities which ever degraded human nature. A virtual dissolution of the Union will have taken place while the forms of its existence remain. One section will stand in menacing and hostile array against the other. The collision of opinion will be quickly followed by force of arms. The abolitionists should not flatter themselves that having consolidated the North against the South, they will enter the contest with superior numbers that will ensure victory. But if they conquer, who will they conquer? Unquote. So there's a speech that tells you the mood of the country. The idea that the white people of the North, whatever this little group of radical abolitionists, their wish to convince them what to do, want nothing to do with free black people in their communities. They want nothing to do with them. And so as a result, there's no effort being made in the Senate or the House during Henry Clay's lifetime, where some senator from a minority state has stepped up to the plate and taken to the floor to offer a bill to compensate from the Treasury of the United States the value of slaves held in bondage in the southern states, particularly with sections in that bill authorizing transportation of those freed blacks into the territories of the United States, with some funding to be provided for a period of time to get these newly freed black people and their families on their feet. And the legislatures of the northern states, in cooperation with this effort in the Senate, have stricken from their law books the legislation that prohibits the presence of free black people in their states, so that migration can occur freely among all states in this black population, now free to disperse itself demographically across the entire United States with all the people, North and South, sharing in the obvious burdens. The economic burdens, the social burdens, the political burdens that freeing this population necessarily entailed. Now, it doesn't matter whether these people are color purple or yellow or brown or black, the problems would be there. The white population was not ready for it, was not mature for it. And as we're going to see, they didn't have the moral courage. Daniel Webster now, 20 years later, comes back to this idea. Quote, dismemberment of this vast country with a convulsion. Who is so stupid to think such a thing? Peaceable secessions? Sir, your eyes and mind are never destined to see that thing. I see it as plainly as I see the sun in heaven. I see the disruption must produce such a war as I will not describe.
Now, if any gentleman from the South shall propose a scheme of colonization to be carried out by this government upon a large scale for the transportation of these colored people to any place in the world, I should be quite disposed to incur almost any degree of expense to accomplish that object. I would return to Virginia and through her, for the benefit of the whole South, the money received for the lands and territories ceded to her by this government for any such purpose as to relieve or in any way diminish her deal beneficially with the free colored population in the southern states." Unquote. Now, 2 points. First, he's talking about the fact at the time the Constitution was being drafted at the convention in Philadelphia. The Congress of the United States was sitting in session in New York under the old Articles of Confederation. And present at the time was an offer by Virginia to give up its rights to all the territory east of the Ohio River up to the Mississippi River. And in exchange, in a side deal between the framers and these representatives in Congress, it was agreed that the framers would insert into the Constitution recognition of the constitutional right to hold Africans as property in exchange for Virginia ceding the territory north of the Ohio River with the stipulation that slavery would not be permitted there. And that happened. And over time, the government sold the lands and received money in return. It is this money that Webster is suggesting should be used, not to support the transportation of recently freed slaves into the territories of the United States, or to the states north of the Mason-Dixon line, but to pay for the transportation of freed slaves outside of the United States. Some 20 years later, after Clay's first speech, still, despite all this agitation that is going on, the people of the North are not offering the idea that let's free these Africans across the board and assimilate them into our society. Well, why not? Racism. Now, Webster goes on, quote, "There has been received in the Treasury $80 million, the proceeds of the sale of the public lands ceded by Virginia. Is the residue should be sold at the same rate the whole aggregate would see $200 million. If Virginia and the South see fit to adopt any proposition to relieve themselves from this free colored people among them, they have my free consent, and the government pay any sum of money out of these proceeds that may be adequate for the purpose." Unquote. Now let me explain what he means here. These are the Africans that are already free for a variety of reasons over the last 25 years, and there's about 150,000 of these people in Virginia. There's about another 200,000 in Maryland and Delaware, all pushed up against the northern border of the state without authority to cross into Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana barring their presence in the state. Racism, folks. Now Webster then goes on again about secession. Quote, "And now, Mr. President, instead of speaking of the possibility or utility of secession, instead of dwelling in these caverns of darkness, instead of groping with these ideas so full of all this hard and horrible, let us cherish those hopes that belong to us. Let our comprehension be as broad as the country for which we act. Let us make our generation the brightest link in the golden chain which is destined, I believe, to gavel the people of all the states to this Constitution." Unquote. Is he prophetic? Or he just doesn't recognize yet that the only way this is going to happen is by war? 3 days later, William Seward, who had just entered the Senate, freshman senator, rose from his seat and made his maiden speech. And this is what he had to say. Quote, "There are constitutions, but when we are legislating for states, especially when we are founding states, all of these laws must be brought to the standard of the laws of God. All this was explained by a political philosopher in England in these words, quote, "There is but one law for all, namely the law which governs all law, the law of the Creator, the law of humanity, the law of nature and nations," unquote. Seward also rejected this idea of using money from the Treasury to pay for transportation of these colored people. And when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Why wouldn't you want to do that if you're a Republican? Why relieve the southern states of what is obviously to them the social and political burden of having side by side their slaves, free Africans, to agitate, to set an example, to put bad ideas in the minds of those slaves? Why not be able to get rid of them at the expense of the federal government while retaining your own slaves? That's just ridiculous. But even now, in 1854, everything is heating up to the Civil War. Even Seward is not standing there on the Senate floor offering a bill for passage that would offer compensation to the slave owners for the Africans they hold as property, along with commitments to disperse these free Africans across the breadth of the United States. Why not? Well, because the constituency that elected him won't stand for it. Those immigrants from Ireland and Germany that are populating all the territories want nothing to do with Africans in their community. And this is what is bringing us to civil war. This inability of the white people to express their moral courage. And then Seward cut to the core, cut to the very bottom of the cause of the Civil War when he said this from his seat on the Senate floor. Quote, "We are now arrived at that stage of our national progress when that crisis, the war, can be foreseen. It is directly before us. Its shadow is upon us, and now it seems to me that all our difficulties arise not out of unlawful questions about the perversion of slavery, but from the want of moral courage to meet this question of emancipation as we ought." Unquote. In terms of human history, in terms of political science, it all comes down to the community. All around the world today, in every part of it, on every continent, this American principle that the people have the sovereign right to throw off their governments is being executed. This principle has been embraced by the peoples of the entire world. Scotland recently executed the principle in a referendum to leave Britain. A province in Canada continually tries to separate itself from the Canadian Confederation. Countries in Africa at peoples of certain tribes within their territory seeking to disassociate themselves from the central government. Eastern Europe, provinces that once belonged to Russia have seceded. In the Balkans, the Serbs and the Bosnians. Where in the world is this principle not, right now as we speak, an active force? And so the trick is, we don't want another civil war. Community means something. To make it mean something to the whole body of Americans as an indivisible unit against the world, what a challenge in political science. So now it's important when looking at this time in American history to apply objective thought to an examination of the records leading to the Civil War and draw honest conclusions from them. And in doing so, assess the popular accepted historians' view that their perspective might be skewed for any number of academic, political, or other biases, and thus must be scrutinized on their face value. The fact is, the North won the war, and America has gone on to grow into one of the great nations of the world. It is understandable, then, when historians write from that perspective. The causes of the war put forth in the history books paint a noble picture of the North, of leaders and citizens fighting the good fight, taking the moral high ground, trying to end the scourge of slavery and build a mighty nation. Yes, it's understandable why historians create that narrative. But a truer examination of the record paints a different picture that led to war. It is that elephant in the room we spoke of at the outset of this video. We must recognize the elephant, accept it, and be stronger by doing so. The Southern people wanted nothing more than to exercise the Jeffersonian principle of supreme authority lies in the hands of the people and to throw off an oppressive government. But for the backbone and vision of Abraham Lincoln, they might well have succeeded. Lincoln saw a different future for America, one of a united, powerful country dominating the Western Hemisphere. He knew the obstacles he faced to accomplish this in light of the Secession crisis. Among them, he fully understood the slave issues as perceived by the Northern people as well as those in the South. He was willing to do whatever it took to achieve his goal of maintaining the Union, even if it meant instigating the war by trickery to spur the North out of their complacency. He had no issue circumnavigating the Constitution with spurious arguments against the legality of secession if it meant keeping the Union together. Most importantly of all, though, Lincoln understood from the beginning that white racism was embedded in Northern society and that war was the only possible resolution. He recognized this fact as early as the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858. He thought then the only solution was to free the slaves and ship them off American soil, knowing that white people would not accept them into their communities. History books need to recognize that monumental issues plagued pre-war America, issues that led to civil war, but that those issues were not the cause. A lack of moral courage to face the results of abolition and accept free black families into the communities was the cause of the war. The inability of government to solve all the issues and conflicts cited by historians as the cause of the war was rooted in Northern white racism, the real root cause of America's greatest war. I want to take a moment now to acknowledge and thank Joe Ryan, a retired trial attorney from California, for his dedication and perseverance in studying the Civil War and applying criminal trial court evidentiary standards to assess the war records and to write a credible alternative historical interpretation of the war. Without his strict legal discipline in assessing authentic first-hand records, we're at the mercy of the accepted historical narrative. Mr. Ryan did the painstaking research, drawing many of the conclusions presented here, with which I wholeheartedly concur. Much of the script was his, edited and augmented, so I understand more clearly and hopes others do too. So a sincere thanks to Joe for opening my eyes to look beyond the accepted narrative of popular historians. I also want to assure viewers the ideas presented here are a point of view. They are presented for academic discussion and don't represent an agenda or dogma. Others may have different views than the conclusions drawn, and those differences enrich us all in examining the Civil War. For the record, I support neither the Northern history nor the Southern history, just a fair examination of the record. Thanks for watching.